All right, welcome everybody. We've started recording. This is the Cluster API project office hours. We do have some meeting etiquette. Make sure if you want to speak up, you can raise your hand, use the raise a hand feature of Zoom, and we'll call on you. We do have an agenda in the document that I'm sharing here at the below. Please add any information you have there. I'm going to try to keep us on track by encouraging you all to follow that meeting etiquette. So this is the CNCF meeting, and we do have a code of conduct, so please be sure to follow that as well. Okay, so I'm James. I've kind of been in the meetings a few times here. Let's see what we got. We have public service announcements. Joel, looks like you have the first one.
Thank you. So there's a externally managed cluster infrastructure proposal open at the moment. It's actually raised by Alberto, but he's not here today, I don't think. We had a meeting about it last week. That was really productive, and we decided on some various changes. But basically, this change is like a contract change for the providers. The idea being that we'll have an annotation that will prevent cluster infrastructure reconciling happening in any of the providers. So because this obviously is going to affect all provider implementations, I'd like to encourage anyone who maintains any of those or is interested in this to take a look at the proposal as it's now been updated with the feedback from last week's discussion. The use case, if you're not familiar with this, is basically so that you could have some external thing, maybe like Terraform or Kops, create your cluster infrastructure and then use the Cluster API machine controllers still to create the machines for your Kubernetes cluster.
Cool. Anybody have any comments or thoughts on that? Cecile, go ahead.
Hey, so when we had the discussion last week, I know there are two big points that were still like open questions. Have there been any movement on those, or are they still open for discussion?
I don't think there was anything decided after that meeting. Do you know which ones you were referring to in particular?
The first one was whether to use an annotation or add an extra field, and then I forget the second one, but I know there was something else.
Okay, I was of the impression we'd sort of agreed on the annotation approach, so the proposal's been updated to go down the annotation approach, but we can, I'll dig those out and double check, and maybe come back to this at the end of the meeting if I can work it out.
Okay, I think Vince wrote both down in his comments after the meeting on the proposal. So.
Cool. Any other comments? All right. So we'll go on to the discussion topics here. So Fabrizio, you've got the first one on CAPE for the kubeadm types.
Thank you, James. A few days ago, I filed a PR for a new CAEP, which is about Kubernetes types. So I would like to describe this initiative a little bit to the community. So first point is that this is a required activity because Kubernetes types are being removed. Kubernetes types in 1.1 are being removed from Kubernetes. So it is something that we have to do as soon as possible. Second is that the proposal is organized around a goal, which is to remove the constraints that today we have that basically requires that the Kubernetes types in Kubernetes are equal to the Kubernetes types that are supported on the machine. And this constraint is particularly bad because basically it requires that all the Kubernetes version in our SKU have to support the same API, which is technically very, very difficult. So in order to basically overcome this limitation, we are introducing in Cluster API conversion from the KubeMin types, which are hosted in Cluster API, and the right version of the KubeMin type, which are expected on the machine. So at the end of this, let me say, path, Cluster API will own its own copy of KubeMin types. And in step 2, which is future work, not included in this proposal, we will basically start cleaning up this type, because now they are different and we have conversion, and do stuff like simplifying the UX. For instance, we can remove the control plane endpoint from the KubeMin type, or the networking configuration for the KubeMin type, because those types, those values are already defined in cluster level, and basically today they are defined in 2 parts, and the user can eventually even shoot on their own foods. So this is more or less the background on the proposal. And if there are questions, I'm happy to answer that.
Okay, does anybody have any questions on this proposal? Jason?
Yeah, I think the question that I have is what is the plan for unknown versions of Kubernetes, or is this going to basically mean that you have to run a version of Cluster API that knows about the version of Kubernetes that you're going to deploy on a host with this proposal?
I think that the answer is yes, but we have this was also one of the comment on the proposal. The answer is yes, but we still have a certain let me say tolerance, because whenever KubeMin is going to introduce a new API, then he still have to respect 1 year before deprecating the next one, and this gives Cluster API a certain amount of time to basically catch up with the unknown version that pop ups in the future. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we weren't going to lock into having to know about new versions of Kubernetes for a particular version of Cluster API, as long as we can create a compatible kubeadm type.
Yeah, noted. In short word, we will get basically the latest for the known version of Kubernetes, we will apply the latest known version of KubeMin, and the assumption is that this will be supported at least for 1 year. So
Great. Any other comments, questions? Do we have anybody might be able to take notes? Anybody want to volunteer for that? Just noticed we don't have a note taker. Okay.
I can add Jason comment after I finish to speak about the next point.
Okay, yep, go ahead, Fabrizio, you got the second one here too.
Okay, so this is an implementation detail, but I would like to share with the community. So today in Cluster Cattle we have 2 types. One is the provider type, which is basically managing the inventory of provider that you are installing, and the second one is the metadata type that most of the infrastructure provider knows, because they are adding this file to their artifacts. The original, today these types are in V1 Alpha 3, and the original idea was to use the operator work in order to make a clean conversion from current types in cluster cattle to the target one, which are the one defined in the operator. Given that the operator work most probably is not happening this cycle, or we don't know yet in where we will get, my proposal is to keep the provider metadata types in cluster cattle. So these two types, which are cluster cattle specific, in V1 Alpha 3 for this cycle. And basically wait for the operator for doing a proper conversion. The alternative is to basically implement a V1 Alpha 4 version of those type without any change, and then implement a key conversion procedure in cluster cattle itself. So given that the work on the operator is only, let me say, postponed, I would like to avoid to make this hack.
Anyone have any thoughts on either of those options there? Whether we use the V1 Alpha 3 or whether moving towards V1 Alpha 4 with the hacky type. Sounds like V1 Alpha 3 would be the preferred way. El Miko.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like it would be the least hassle for users to wait until the operator, to wait until we have the operator before doing that conversion. Assuming people are okay with continuing to use V1 Alpha 3 for now.
Do we have a maybe an issue open for this that we could potentially just document that decision there?
Yeah, we'll open an issue with this decision. The point come up because I created a PR going with the alternative approach, and then basically I found it not nice, and so I had a quick alignment with Vince, and we decided to raise the topic, but it definitely makes sense to take the decision.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so are there any other comments or thoughts? All right, otherwise, Joel, we'll give it back to you for following up on a couple of the items from earlier in the meeting.
Okay, yeah. So as Cecile mentioned, there were a couple of sort of unanswered questions that we didn't get an answer on during the call last week. So one of these was whether to use an annotation to signal the externally managed cluster infrastructure or whether to use a spec field. There was some suggestion that it would be easier to provide utilities towards making the providers stop using or stop reconciling these objects if it was an annotation based. So the proposal's been updated to lean towards the annotation. There isn't too much on an alternative for that. So I can add another bit to the proposal that says, an alternative is to use a spec field. And I'll try and add a section to weigh up the pros and cons of that. The second part was about how does the cluster infrastructure become ready? So part of this proposal is to reuse the existing cluster infrastructure resource. So like a AWS cluster, for example. As part of the cluster API contracts, before any machines can be created, something has to mark the status of that to say that that infrastructure is ready. Initially, it's proposed that you will have to write something yourself like some sort of controller that will mark that as ready for you when your external provisioning is done. There was a question also about like, what if I'm using something like Terraform and I don't have the ability to write a controller? Could I have some tooling to mark that ready for like manually? That has been documented as like a future piece of work for adding some sort of like cluster Kotlin extension to do that, or kube control extension, or some sort of tooling that would allow someone to manually do that. That's all discussed in a future work.
How does this relate to kind of the work that Cecile was doing with enabling the cluster infrastructure provisioning becoming ready? Does that have any tie into this at all here?
Are you talking about the Bootstrap failure detection?
Yeah.
It's not directly related. Like what I'm doing is mostly for Bootstrap providers. So it's a contract for the Bootstrap providers, and then it's up to infrastructure providers to leverage it or not. It's completely optional. The signal is there. They can consume it if they want, or they can not consume it. So in this case, if you're bringing your own infrastructure, you could have something that does that check or not.
Does anybody else have any thoughts, Fabrizio?
Okay, a little bit about this. So my personal opinion is that I don't have strong preferences with regards to field of annotation. What I think I would like to prefer is that we are not, let me say, embedding into all the infrastructure provider basically taking care of an external provider system. So our infrastructure provider, in my opinion, should remain as simple as possible. Only take care of their notation if they have to ignore reconciliation, but I would like to avoid if statement along the line. So I'm +1 for an external things that set the status already.
Yes, to sort of add to that, the proposal at the moment states that if this annotation is there, then the provider infrastructure cluster controller should just ignore it completely. So no reconciliation whatsoever. Whatever is managing this external infrastructure should be doing that and doing any checks that are necessary to make sure the provider is actually ready. So yeah, it shouldn't really, in terms of the changes to the providers, it should just be a case of, if you see this annotation or spec field, whatever, just ignore it. So it should add very little extra complication to the current providers.
Thank you, great.
Okay, so I think if there's nothing else there, we're at the end of the agenda here, unless anybody wants to add anything at the end.
Yeah, Prakash here. Can you hear me?
Hi, yes, go ahead.
So specs is always required. Status is not. So if you change anything in the specs and expect that they be ignored, I'm not understanding that portion of it. So are we confusing the readiness of the cluster versus the type of the cluster? What does the external provider expect here, or should expect here in the spec in that case?
So the idea here is that you've got some other system, right? This could be something like COPS that creates that whole cluster infrastructure for you, creates the VPC, creates the subnets, etc. It would fulfill the spec of the AWS cluster resource in this case, with the details from the infrastructure that it provided. And then that is basically used as a point for the machine controller to consume that data. So we're not actually using that resource as a this is my desired state, something is going to reconcile it, although theoretically you could using this model. It's more of this is an informational resource using an existing interface that we already have. Don't know if that helps answer the question.
So should there not be, should the cluster API having got this provider spec, should use that spec instead of using its own spec in that case?
Sorry, I didn't really understand that.
So what I'm saying is, if you have cluster API and this is what our cluster API specs is, and it has a field which you are adding, which says that, okay, it is ready, not ready. And the confusion here is the spec which is provided by the external provider, which says that, okay, here is my spec for the cluster. And that spec is stating that it is a type V13, V14, whatever you call it. And if that is not, is there not a disparity between the two? Why should there be any disparity? Cluster API gets a specs, whether it gets the external specs or it uses its own spec. Why there are two different things then? Why are there two different things?
So there isn't really two different things. We're trying to consolidate this so that we keep that same interface and that same contract. So the AWS cluster resource, like the CR custom resource at this point, just becomes a data structure. Like there's no control, well, in terms of like, if you're using something like COPS, maybe like there's no controller that's running COPS that's watching this. It's just something populates that data in there at the beginning. And so like in the normal case where you're using like the kubeadm control plane provisioning, like when the cluster infrastructure provider creates the VPC, it sets the VPC ID into that spec field, where in this case, it would be just coming from whatever COPS has created. But we're still going to use the same resource, so there's no duplication of like the data structures at least.
So it's just a duplication of data structure, and we internally want to change it in terms of status, as you mentioned, right? Ready or not ready?
Yeah, so the status to be usable to create machines, the cluster infrastructure has to have a ready condition on the status. So because it's very hard to update the status of resources using like kube control or something, we're going to need something to do that long term. So in the first implementation, you would have to write your own controller that says, okay, when I see one of these external clusters, I'm going to like check the infrastructure that it says is ready, and then mark the object as ready. In the long term, we want to make that so that people can do that manually as well.
So
if
it
they
is
don't
nothing
want
to
to
do
write
with the
controller.
specs. It is nothing to do with the specs. It has to only do with the status, which is not a required field. Okay, got it. Makes sense. Thanks.
No worries.
Okay. Any other questions on that or any new topics that we want to discuss today? No? Okay. And thanks to Nadir for taking some notes. And I think I saw a couple other folks doing it as well, so thank you. And I think, and Amilko, sorry if I got your name wrong there. And otherwise, have a great day. I think that's the end of the meeting today.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Thank you, James.
See you all.